Hey everyone, thank you so much to all of you who watched my last video on checks. A lot of people seem to enjoy the explanation, so I hope to keep improving these videos and get them to be better resources for the community. Alright, so let's get into the next topic, conditions. I know a lot of people have been asking for this video, but let's start off with the basics. What is a condition? Okay, so I'm going to be real, this was the first challenge in making this video because the rules never define what a condition is, so after reaching out to some people for their best definition, this is what I've settled on. A condition is a buff or debuff which can be applied to a creature by natural effects, hostile monsters, or even allies. A creature is subject to every part of a condition until they find a way to remove it from themselves, or its duration expires. But really the definition of conditions isn't what confuses people. So let me show off why I think many people get confused by conditions in DC20. Okay, so here I have all the conditions in the game, but you'll notice I laid them out weirdly. See, the thing about conditions in DC20 is that they can reference other conditions. So as a biology teacher, my first instinct was to map the relationship between conditions like a food web. We can call this the condition ecosystem. Alright, so don't be freaked out, but this is the condition ecosystem. So hopefully you can feel reassured for being a little bit confused by conditions. It took me a while planning this video just to decide in what order I wanted to cover the conditions because alphabetical order just wouldn't make sense a lot of the times. So instead, I'll be moving through this ecosystem from the top to the bottom. So we're going to start with the conditions that don't reference other conditions and work our way down. That way I'm never mentioning a condition I didn't talk about earlier in the video. So let's get to it. Starting with the basic continuous damage conditions, bleeding and burning. In both cases, you take some damage at the start of each of your turns. Bleeding does 1 true damage, which is basically unpreventable damage, and burning does 1 fire damage. Now bleeding can be removed by spending 1 AP to make a DC10 medicine check. You even get 1 temporary hit point for each 5 you beat the DC by. Receiving any kind of healing also removes bleeding. An important note here is that temporary hit points don't count as healing, so it needs to be actual healing. Meanwhile, burning is more straightforward to remove. Simply spend 1 AP to put out the flames. No check required. Importantly, other creatures can take these actions as long as they're within 1 space of you, so your friends can also patch up your wounds or pat out the flames. Next, we have incapacitated. This is a pretty rough condition. Being incapacitated means not being able to speak, concentrate like you would on a concentration spell, or spend any AP. It's simple but really devastating, since it basically just takes you out of the fight. Somewhat related to that is Grappled. Now this one's pretty complicated, and I'll likely make a whole video in the future just on grappling and the related mechanics. But for now, I want to talk about the condition itself. First off, your speed is 0 while grappled, and you have disadvantage on agility saves. This is kind of interesting since it means grappling is one of the easiest ways to affect an enemy save, but it only works for agility. Since grappling involves 2 people, the grappler and the target, it's a bit more complicated when it comes to ending the condition. The most straightforward way is to try to break free using your martial check, so athletics or acrobatics, contested by the enemy's athletics check. If your roll beats theirs, then congratulations, you're no longer grappled. You could also break the grapple by incapacitating the grappler, and this is where I'm afraid to say my ecosystem drawing lied a bit. By my own definition, grappled mentions incapacitated, but since incapacitation isn't a main part of the effects of being grappled, I gave it a pass. Besides that, you could even try to break out of the grapple if either you or the grappler are forcibly moved apart from each other. If an effect tries to force either of you to move, it's always the grappler who makes the check or save required to see if the person is moved. If they succeed, then both of you stay put, but if they fail, then the grapple ends and you're forced apart. Finally, it's worth mentioning that if the target of the grapple starts to fall, the grapple doesn't automatically end, but the grappler does have to be strong enough to carry your weight. Otherwise, they fail to hold on, and the grapple does end. Alright, that's probably one of the most complicated conditions out of the way, so let's do some easier ones. Like Charmed. When you're Charmed, the Charmer has advantage on all charisma checks against you. Additionally, you can't target them with any kind of harmful attacks, abilities, or effects. This still doesn't make them your ally though, it just means you can't bring yourself to harm them. Next up is Deafened. This one's pretty intuitive. You automatically fail any check that requires hearing, and all creatures are considered unheard by you. On top of that, you have resistance half to sonic damage, since you can't hear the noises as effectively, but you're not immune, those shockwaves from the sound still damage your body, even if you can't hear them. Okay, so what's this unheard condition? Did I lie yet again about conditions not being referenced? Well, this time I didn't technically lie, because unheard isn't a condition. It's part of the prerequisites to hide from people. Either way, I put up on the screen the rules talking about being unheard, if you care, It's mainly just that you have to make no noise to be considered unheard. Alright, so let's get back to the actual conditions, like the X conditions as I call them, doomed and exhausted. The X here represents that these conditions come at different levels of severity. Let's start with doomed. If you're doomed, your death's door threshold is decreased by X. For example, most level 1 characters have a death's door threshold of 3. If they're affected by Doom 2, then their death's door threshold is just 1. But if your death's door threshold becomes 0, then you're in a risky spot. At that point, being reduced to 0 HP would immediately kill you. There would be no death's door. Even more brutal than that, though, is exhaustion. Each level of exhaustion will reduce your checks, saves, speed, and save DC by 1. This affects nearly everything your character has to do in combat, and even out of combat. If you manage to get all the way to exhaustion 6, then your character immediately dies. Okay, so let's get to the real reason I had to make a whole checks video before this one, and that's what I like to call the core trinity of conditions. So here we have Impaired, Hindered, and Dazed. Impaired gives you disadvantage on physical checks. So as a throwback to the last video, that means might checks, agility checks, and attack checks. Meanwhile, Dazed gives you disadvantage to all mental checks, meaning charisma checks, intelligence checks, and spell checks. So finally we have Hindered, which gives disadvantage to attacks. And so at this point, many people ask the question, what's the point of using Hindered when I can just use Impaired instead? The answer here goes back to something I talked about in my last video. Not all attacks use attack checks, so Impaired only affects martial attacks, like weapon attacks, and Dazed only affects spell attacks, but Hindered affects both. So if you want to shut down the attacks from a character like a Spellblade that can use both spells and basic weapon attacks, then you'll have to use Hindered. Lastly, you'll notice that both Impaired and Dazed have a heavy version, heavily impaired and heavily dazed. These versions affect saves too. So heavily impaired adds disadvantage on physical saves, and heavily dazed adds disadvantage on mental saves. Now, the easiest and most common condition, lying at the center of our condition ecosystem, exposed. If you're exposed, attacks against you have advantage. Again, this can be either martial attacks or spell attacks. It's a super simple condition, but we'll see it being referenced by a bunch of other conditions. Alright, so let's cover the two conditions I'm calling the fight or flight conditions, Intimidated and Taunted. I'm grouping these together because I feel like they occupy a similar vibe of getting into an enemy's head. If you're intimidated, that means you have disadvantage on all checks as long as the source of your intimidation is within line of sight. DC20 has rules for what line of sight means. On a grid, something is in your line of sight if you can draw a straight line from any corner of your space to any corner of its space. So no silly shenanigans involving closing your eyes or looking down to avoid the effects of intimidation. Meanwhile, being taunted gives you disadvantage on attacks against anyone besides the person or thing that taunted you. So intimidating shuts someone down as long as you're nearby, but taunting just makes it harder for them to hit other people. Alright, now for the last basic condition that doesn't mention other conditions, slowed. The description on slowed is that each space you move costs 2 spaces of movement. So normally walking around, not slowed, is 1 space of movement to move a single space. But when slowed, you need 2 spaces of movement to move a single space. There's a little bit more to this, but we'll talk about that when we get to stacking conditions near the end of the video. Back to our continuous damage conditions, this one's a bit more complicated, poisoned. Like any other continuous damage condition, you take 1 damage at the start of each of your turns. Intuitively, it's poison damage for the poison condition. On top of that though, you're also impaired, so you have disadvantage on physical checks. You can try ending the poison condition by spending 1 AP to make a medicine check against the DC of the poison. Same as bleeding and burning, a creature within 1 space could also take the action to try to end the condition. Next up we have the upgraded version of Grappled, Restrained. While Restrained, you suffer from the same downsides as being grappled, though your speed is 0, and you have disadvantage on agility saves. On top of that though, you also have disadvantage on attacks, and enemies have advantage on attacks against you. Next, we have the 2 sight-based conditions, invisible and blinded. If you're invisible, you have advantage on attacks, and enemies have disadvantage on attacks against you. Meanwhile, if you're blinded, you automatically fail checks that require sight, and have disadvantage on attacks, and other creatures have advantage on attacks against you. You might have noticed that these two are opposites of each other, which makes sense intuitively, but it's also because they both play off of being unseen. This is similar to Unheard, where it isn't a condition, but in this case it does involve conditions. Okay, so I've swapped out a bit of the rules about the invisible condition with the description for unseen. And this is because being invisible is basically the same thing as being unseen. So if you're unseen, you have advantage on attacks against creatures that can't see you, and those creatures also have disadvantage on attacks against you. Alright, so let's talk about a very popular condition, prone. While prone, you have disadvantage on attacks, ranged attacks have disadvantage against you, but melee attacks have advantage against you. Additionally, you can't move normally. You have to crawl on the ground, which acts like being slowed, requiring 2 spaces of movement to crawl a single space. You can stand up from prone using 2 spaces of movement instead, so the same amount it would take to crawl a space, but doing so will provoke opportunity attacks from creatures that can take them. Prone can be a really powerful condition to inflict in melee since both crawling away and standing up provoke opportunity attacks, while giving advantage to melee attackers and giving disadvantage on attacks to the prone target as well. Moving on to the upgraded version of Incapacitated, we have Stunned. You get all the usual drawbacks of Incapacitated, so no speaking, concentrating, or spending AP. But on top of all that, you also automatically fail physical saves, and creatures have advantage on attacks against you. Now, the text here says you automatically fail agility, might, and physical saves, but this is a bit of a redundant holdover from previous versions that will be fixed, since agility saves and might saves are the physical saves. So I'm just going to say physical saves. Next is a weird condition, Surprised. Mechanically, Surprised is pretty straightforward. Enemies have advantage on attacks against you, and you can't spend any AP. I say it's weird because it only happens as a result of being surprised at the start of combat. It's not something you can inflict using a spell or some ability, at least for now. Okay, so let's talk about the upgraded version of Intimidate, Rattled. So we got the Intimidate basics, disadvantage on all checks while your source of fear is within line of sight, but additionally, you can't willingly move towards it. Interestingly, it seems that only the disadvantage part relies on line of sight. So if you know that the source of your fear is behind a door, you still couldn't move towards it, although that's a niche detail. What if we wanted to go one step further though? That's where we get Frightened. It's the same disadvantage on all checks while the source of fear is within line of sight. But now, not only can you not willingly move towards it, but you have to run away from it, spending as much of your AP as possible on your turn to run away from it as far as you can. If for some reason you can't move away, like already being cornered or restrained, then you can take the dodge action. Frightened is a very powerful effect, locking a creature out of all of its AP on its turn. We're almost at the end of conditions, and to talk about the remaining conditions, I need to talk about Paralyzed. Paralyzed works almost like an upgraded version of Stunned. You automatically fail physical saves, can't speak, concentrate, or spend AP, and enemies have advantage on attacks against you. On top of all that though, if an attack within one space of you would hit, it's automatically considered a critical hit. Alright, if you wanted a condition that rubs even more salt in that wound, you have Unconscious. The same benefits of being paralyzed, failing physical saves, not being able to speak, concentrate, or spend AP, enemies having advantage on attacks against you, even the automatic crits for attacks that hit you within one space. But to add on to all of this, when you're knocked unconscious, you drop what you're holding and fall prone to the ground. And now we have the final boss of conditions, Petrified. I'm going to sound like a broken record because, yet again, you automatically fail physical saves, can't speak, concentrate, or spend AP, enemies will get advantage on attacks against you, and attacks that hit you within one space are considered critical hits. But that's only about half of Petrified. You also get turned to stone, like the name suggests, making you lose awareness of your surroundings and becoming 10 times heavier. As a benefit, if you want to call it that, you get resistance to half to all damage, and become immune to poisons and diseases. If you already had any poisons or diseases that were affecting your body at the time of being petrified, those are put on pause until the petrification ends. Okay, we did it. That's every condition in the game listed out. But I still wanted to cover a couple of things about how these conditions work when you're trying to apply them multiple times. So let's start by talking about stacking conditions. These are conditions that can be applied over and over and will become more debilitating the more times they're inflicted. You have to first keep track of the durations separately, but let's talk about what happens when they stack. First off, Doomed and Exhaustion, which we already kind of covered. Multiple types of these just add on. If I have Doom 1 and Doom 2, it's the same as Doom 3. Slowed is the same. Slowed 1 and Slowed 2 give me Slowed 3. What I mean is, I have to spend that many additional spaces of movement to move a single space. So Slowed 3 means needing to spend 4 spaces of movement just to move a single space. Hindered, Dazed, and Impaired simply add disadvantage each time they're applied. This works even for their heavy versions, like heavily impaired or heavily dazed. Exposed is similar. You have an amount of advantage equal to the amount of instances of exposed. So you might be looking at this and thinking that some conditions feel like they should stack, even if they aren't on this list. And that's probably because you're thinking about overlapping conditions. See, unlike stacking conditions, which get worse the more times they're applied, overlapping conditions simply have the same condition, but it's tracked by multiple sources. So let's take Rattled, for example. You can't move towards the source of your fear while rattled. But if two people are both rattling you, you can't move towards either of them. In both scenarios, however, you only get regular disadvantage on checks, not multiple stacks of disadvantage. These conditions are the ones where there's normally a person or an object that's continuously part of the condition, and the condition often refers to this source or initiator. And the last group of non-stacking conditions. Basically, every other condition in the game just doesn't stack with itself, and most of these make intuitive sense for why they can't be applied multiple times. Except maybe the continuous damage conditions, like bleeding and burning, which you could imagine getting worse and stacking, but this isn't the case. Poison is a weird one, because you could have different poisons affecting you, each with a different DC, but they don't stack. The rules don't specifically mention what to do in this scenario, but I would recommend choosing the strongest poison to be the only one that matters. Otherwise, you're going to have players poisoning themselves with a light poison to avoid the effects of a worse one, but that's just my 2 cents, not an official ruling. Alright, so before I finish this video, I have to clear up one of the biggest confusions surrounding conditions, and something some of you are probably still wondering, and that's what I call single condition stacking. Okay, so let's take the final boss of Petrified here as an example. In the description, Petrified says it gives us Paralyzed, Stunned, and Exposed. Also some other stuff, but that's not what we care about right now. Now, if you'll remember, Paralyzed also includes Stunned and Exposed, and Stunned also includes Exposed. And Exposed does stack with itself. So at this point, a lot of people ask, how much advantage do I have when attacking a petrified target? And this is where I'll say that going by the rules as written of the bold words, highlighted here, Petrified should give 3 stacks of Exposed, for a total of advantage 3. But this is where I think a bit of critical reading can expose the more likely intended outcome. See, after these bolded words is a piece of text, highlighted here, describing the effects. And if you look closely and just read those sections, we get that attacks that hit you are considered critical hits if the attacker is within 1 space of you, you automatically fail physical saves, and attacks against you have advantage. These bits of text don't repeat the phrase about being exposed and granting advantage multiple times. Instead, I think the best, easiest, and likely most intended reading is that you only really get the benefits listed inside the parentheses here after the bolded words. The bolded words themselves are just here to remind you that technically, being exposed is part of being incapacitated, which itself is part of being paralyzed, which is all part of being petrified. This is why I wanted to end on my slide from the start of the video with the conditions ecosystem. It shows how conditions build off each other, and you can see how petrified and unconscious can complicate things. If this diagram makes sense to you, and you see how all these pieces fit together, great. I hope my explanations help with that. And if you're still looking at this and just seeing a mess, that's fine. That's what looking back at the rules is for. If you don't need to memorize every condition from a single video. Plus, I think it's very likely conditions will get reworded in the future for more clarity. And when that day comes, I'll remake this video, and I'll be happy to do so. But until that day comes, this is my attempt to try and clarify a bit of the confusion I've seen around conditions. As always, thank you so much for watching the video. I hope it helped, and until next time, have the best time.